Hi, everyone. Today, we're going to look at how to secure your Automate server with a reverse proxy. The principles will apply to any reverse proxy solution, and along the way, we'll describe the automation theory of proxy service. This webinar is being recorded, and we will have time for questions at the end, so feel free to make use of the Q&A box. We have a bit of a mixed audience today, so we'll start with a bit of a background, but by the end, you'll see plenty of crunchy technical details. So let me fix that echo, and we'll get started. So let's get some introductions out of the way. I'm Jeremy, founder of Automation Theory. My firm specializes in automate infrastructure. We're a small firm, and we strive to take care of your automate servers so you can take care of your clients. Being a smaller firm, we know our clients and their needs very well, and we ourselves have skin in the automate security game. We use the same technologies shown here to protect our own systems. And with that, let's talk about automate. Before we protect an automate server, we need to understand where it's vulnerable. There are parts clumped together in the application. You have agent communication, the user interface, and even a REST API sprinkled in there. And out of the box, on any IIS server, you're going to have some weak ciphers. With Automate, you have certain weak and certain noisy HTTP headers. And also, by default, it's open to the world. And I always like to make the note that any server like this is kind of like a young child. It's going to tell its secrets to everybody. And at this point, I also want to do a little bit of a public service announcement to check your instances for legacy ports being open. In the process of prepping for this webinar and finding examples, there are MSPs who still have MySQL open to the world. And also, during certain server migration projects, you'll open up RDP, and sometimes that doesn't get closed. So just wanted to call that out. So moving back to default IIS settings, let's take a look at what a default Automate server looks like. Anyone who's contacted us for a proxy trial is probably familiar with these. First is a screenshot of Mozilla's header security tool, and the other is SSL Labs. Out of the box, Automate is missing a number of HTTP headers that are standard for web security these days. And every Automate server out of the box gets the same score. SSL settings can vary a little bit between MSPs, depending on the particulars of your environment, scans you've done before, additional hardening measures you've taken. But it's normative for an Automate server stack to see certain older flavors of the TLS protocol. And some of that has to do with compatibility for agent communications. So these items, along with other access control concerns, are the main things that we're looking to tackle with reverse proxies. So without further ado, let's talk about proxies. Reverse proxy technology is always a little bit abstract. So I wanted to quickly touch base on what a reverse proxy is. So we're talking about more than industry buzzwords. Reverse proxy, bare bones, is a web server that sits between your Automate server and the rest of the world, almost like a firewall. A normal proxy is for outbound computer traffic. Think like a computer lab at a school or a library. And similarly, a reverse proxy is for inbound internet traffic. You can think of a proxy almost like an application layer router. Where you go is based on where you're from and a rule set that we can define. So let's take a look at how this applies to defending Automate servers. We want to defend against attacks, and attacks have multiple phases. So this is the Lockheed Martin cybersecurity attack chain, or kill chain, as you'll hear it called. And it's these first 3 points where reverse proxies are really going to shine. We're going to do deep dives into all of these, get really nice, crunchy technical examples. But let's do a glancing overview first. Starting with reconnaissance, the proxy, by nature, hides the true IP address of your Automate server, and it's also able to remove certain details that can be used to fingerprint the underlying technology stack. And we'll talk about why that's important in some later slides. Moving on to weaponization, the proxy camouflages your stack, and sometimes this is enough to stop simple attacks. And the fact that the proxy, we're introducing a different OS and a different web server software in between your Automate server and the attacker, that can also give some protection against more complex threats. And last but certainly not least, proxies can help us block delivery. We can bolt in IPS software and other security technologies that are more traditional at this phase to go ahead and get even more value out of our reverse proxy. And the automation theory proxy service at this phase adds on GeoIP and reputation-based blocking. I always like to note that the amount of protection offered is going to vary a lot based on the actual reverse proxy technology and the options you use with it. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move on to reconnaissance. So both bots and targeted attackers are interested in finding out more about your Automate stack. And unfortunately, the information they glean can be used to construct an attack against you. Such things as, like, what's your operating system? What version of IIS are you running? Are there any vulnerabilities there? Now, there's no such thing as security through obscurity, but it's unwise to advertise your Automate server. I could call mine my production honeypot. Targeted attackers are going to know that we as IT providers have these RMM tools, and they're going to come looking for them. So don't leave the attackers a trail of breadcrumbs. Moving on to our next slide here, we'll see how this looks from an attacker's point of view. This is an Nmap scan of my development Automate server here. And a quick Nmap scan shows that this is IIS on Windows, which is something we all know. But the information here can be used against you. Let's say that there's a 0-day found in this version of IIS. If I'm a bad actor looking to make some money with crypto malware, it's a quick search to see, hey, who on the internet is running this? It also helps me peg your operating system. You're running Windows, and I can start to rifle through other things I know, like, hey, what attacks against Windows are out there? Should I start looking for open RDP ports or other potential attack surfaces? So now let's look at this through a proxy. As you can see here, the names and the faces have changed. Now we can see that, yep, this is HA proxy running on FreeBSD. And to the outside world, this looks like a totally different device. There is nothing, if I were scanning an MSP, nothing inside of me would say, yep, this is an Automate server. And if I were an attacker trying to break in, depending on my competency, I'd either, one, know that this isn't the Automate server, you're hiding it, or B, I'd start to try attacks that aren't applicable here if I'm more green as far as this cryptoing MSP business goes. And last but certainly not least, if I'm a bot scanning the internet for Automate servers or parsing the Shodan API to find would-be targets, this would not register on my search parameters. And speaking of Shodan and web services, these are increasingly used to find potential attacks for, or potential targets for would-be attackers. And these screenshots are real production servers. The one on the right is an automation theory proxy client. And so one thing you can do with reverse proxy is you can configure it to only pass along requests matching the specified parameter. So one thing that we do with our proxy service is we generate a random prefix on the front of the FQDN. It's 16 characters, random hex, and the proxy is configured when there's a web request coming in that it needs to go ahead and have a match of that FQDN. So when you have tools like this, that proxy instance was scanned by IP address. We can see Windows on IIS spits back all of its details. You can see that version number. We have the WCC2 page there. And the proxy on the right saw that this wasn't an actual request, and it spits back a 503 error. It can't find a backend server that matches the rules we've defined. This, by and large, is going to keep you out of the Shodan, Census, and other online scanning tools. And this is critically important in a world where vulnerabilities are sold and then exploited in mass. Because if I have an Automate 0-day, I'm going to come to these scanners and I'm going to search for an Automate server, if I'm an attacker, that is. And then I'm going to scrape together targets. And a lot of people have been asking me in these reverse proxy conversations, saying, would a reverse proxy have stopped something like the Kaseya attacks? And there's no way to know for certain, because there are other things besides Shodan and other open source intelligence tools that you can use to find Automate servers or Kaseya servers. And I don't know where these attackers got their list, but it's very hard to attack a target you can't see. So, moving on here. This is a Shodan search for WCC2. And this part of the Automate infrastructure is very easy to lock onto. And you can see we are able to find 173 Automate servers out in the wild. And like I mentioned before, if I have a 0-day, I can get a Shodan API key. I can dump everything that matches and start to robo exploit. So if this is the game we're playing, then our strategy for defending it needs to be a lot different. And Shodan here is nice enough to tell me that this first server actually has vulnerabilities. And looking at this, you can see a lot of bad practice here. I'll call out in a second. I honestly thought this was a honeypot. Perch actually has Automate servers out in the wild they use as honeypots to detect attacks. And I dug in a little more, and unfortunately, this isn't a honeypot. This is a real MSP, and they're running Automate on a self-signed certificate with weak ciphers on an unpatched server, and they're running, I want to say, it's version 11, which I want to say is good old lab tech before the rebrand to Automate. So in any event, you don't want your server to be discoverable in these tools, and the MSP above, they don't stand a chance. And the driving reason is because we're able to find them and enumerate these servers. So let's shift gears here and talk about how to stop the next phase of an attack. With that, actually see we have some Q&A questions, so I will go ahead and pause for some of those. Okay, so question here. Do you know if anyone has used Cloudflare as a reverse proxy? So there's actually a good forum thread out there for Cloudflare. There are people in the community who have done it. And when we get to how the automation theory service works, I can speak to a little bit more about the differences. With Automate, it is hard to go ahead and separate and isolate some of that TCP and UDP traffic. And if you're only wanting to do the TCP 443, you can do it. If you're trying to get a full proxy, then a solution like Cloudflare is going to fall apart. Next question is this applicable to hosted Automate, and can you use a reverse proxy and change SSL ciphers? You can deploy a proxy, and we can point your agents to it. And again, when we get to the network diagram at the end, the only thing I can't do is force the use of the proxy as a technical control. You'll always be able to talk directly to your hosted Automate instance. So with that, let's talk about weaponization. Weaponization is the pairing of malicious code with an attack vector. Basically, we're finding a vulnerability and then matching it up with code that can exploit it. Automated attackers will see the proxy stack and not your server. And hopefully this gets them to try different attacks. People on the Slack channels have made mention, yeah, we put in a reverse proxy, and all of a sudden there are bots who are trying to, send Apache exploits to my Automate server. And the good news is that Windows is generally not vulnerable to any Nix-based attacks. And certain attacks, it will just be stopped. You'll confuse the low-quality basic bots out in the world. But it's worth noting that certain attacks in the application layer will go ahead and pass through a proxy. And we'll talk about that when we get to some later slides about what the proxy can do and what different implementations and how they work. But let's take a look at how we can bypass some weaponization. So this was actually a fair bit of work to get and to make sure that it really was the proxy proper here. So this is Metasploit. And this is an IIS scanning module, and I pointed it at the LAN IP of my development server, and then I pointed it at the external IP of a proxy instance I had spun up. And this vulnerability contains the ability to run a check to see if your target's vulnerable. And so I put both IPs in as the targets, and we checked. And the LAN IP comes back, yep, it's vulnerable. And the external IP says you can't exploit it. And the first time I ran this, I actually triggered the IPS rules on the proxy. There's a bad TLS handshake. And I went back and I turned off the IPS rules, and it still said that it wasn't exploitable. It wasn't just the fact that the IPS had blocked the communication. And if you remember back to an earlier slide where if we're not asking for the FQDN, the proxy returns back a 503 error, I also tested this with the FQDN of the proxy, and it still came back and said it's not exploitable. So Metasploit is thoroughly convinced that the proxy is not vulnerable to this attack. And this is exactly what we want as defenders in the MSP space. This is, but by no means doesn't make your Automate server invincible. And the success of this type of measure is highly dependent on the actual tool and module you're using. And if I really wanted to, I could still tell this module, go ahead and try it. But again, if I'm doing mass scans on the internet, trying to find Automate servers, or otherwise trying to use a bot to run timed exploits, etc., this makes it harder to attack my server. So with that, let's move on to our last phase and some additional protections we can have from attack delivery. And looks like we don't have any more questions that have come in yet. So let's talk about delivery. At this phase, we're concerned about the vehicle being used to deliver the attack to the target. And with a reverse proxy, the focus is on the network coming from the WAN side of things. But there are other potential delivery vectors. Think a lot about the inside of your network as well. I won't have any side tangents during this webinar, but there are definitely potential threats inside the LAN. So moving along here, not all scanning technologies are alike. So when we talk about IPS scanning, or when we talk about things like WAFs, it's important to know the details. Some are doing deep packet inspection, some aren't. Some are decoding the application layer, and some aren't. And regardless of that, proxies are a great place to add additional reinforcing layers. And the Automation Theory Proxy Service adds everything you see on the slide. And we'll go ahead and actually touch on these in some upcoming slides. But first, I want to take a closer look at one of the more, in my opinion, nuanced technologies, which is GeoIP. So GeoIP is a super familiar technology that personally I think is underutilized in defending servers. It's certainly not foolproof, but again, back to our different types of attackers, it'll stop your dumb bot-based attacks, and unfortunately, you can get exploited by a dumb bot with a 0 day. And if you remember about this time last year, when the vulnerability came out, we were all changing server passwords. There was an IP address that was scanning Automate servers and going ahead and collecting those installers and getting those server passwords. And that was based outside of the United States. So real basic measures like this can actually have a huge impact. And if you remember earlier how we talked about that by default, Automate servers are kind of like young children, it's bad to let your Automate server talk to strangers on the internet, especially if you don't have clients who reside in Russia, China, or India. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a screenshot of an Automation Theory proxy being accessed from outside its GeoIP range. And this is Amsterdam, if that's a little too small on the screen for you. And as you can see, the server's not replying, which is exactly what we want. However, it's important to test the rules. GeoIP is more of an art than a science. I ran into this scenario actually recently with a prospect. So IP ranges can be owned by a company in one country, but deployed at their data center in another. You can also have IP addresses change countries when transactions like that happen. So with a little hiccup like this in the rules, I was able to wiggle around existing GeoIP rules and see a prospective client's Automate server from my GeoIP tester box in India. So as we transition to more advanced usages of reverse proxies, let's take a passing look at TLS hardening. Reverse proxies are commonly used to perform the TLS offloading, and we can configure what ciphers and protocols are used outside of IIS on Windows. Best part, you can do it without a reboot. A proxy also gives you the ability to serve up different protocol flavors on different sites. So, and you can combine that with ACLs, and this can allow us to get around some of that. I have legacy clients who, one MSP I was talking to earlier this week had a lot of embedded POS systems, and they were stuck with TLS 1.0. So what you can do in a situation like that, you can have multiple front ends served up by your proxy. So your primary, prefix.proxy.com can be TLS 1.2, and you can list that as the first server address in your agent template, and you can run the very best TLS ciphers on that front end. Then you can add legacy.proxy.com, and you can have that running on TLS 1.0 for backwards compatibility, and you can add that as the second server FQDN. So by default, when you install an agent, it'll try the secure ciphers first and then fail over to that secondary front end. And normally, this configuration does require that second FQDN to listen on a separate port, but that's something very easy to do, at least with the automation theory proxy service. So now that we've looked at some of this and started to kind of get thinking outside of the box about what we can do with a proxy, let's look at some other advanced usage abilities. So a reverse proxy can control behavior all the way up to layer 7. And we can perform actions based on the nature of the requests. The most common use case I get for this is to use the proxy for agent traffic only and then block the world. And that's coming up on our next slide. But I do want to call out here, it's also possible to restrict access to certain pages, like your Web Control Center login, to a specific list of IP addresses. And last but not least, we can also configure some telemetry logging. I know some out in the audience are very big into their dashboarding, and we can get useful telemetry off of a proxy appliance. So let's take a deeper dive. Again, since we're operating at layer 7, we're able to lock on to these requests and start to impose restrictions. On the slide here, you can see that this is an agent request on the bottom and a normal request to the WCC2 homepage on the top. And our first request, well, 403 for Bidner, and then our page where we're going for agent check-in, and we can still hit that, and it will return to us our server version number. And this, we can also apply the same logic to the desktop control center as well. So if you're trying to solve for, I need my agents to check in and I don't want to manage a slew of IP addresses and try to fix all of the headaches that come with the work from home or changing IPs. My customer's at a coffee shop and needs help connecting his VPN. This is a very simple way to allow the agent traffic largely unfettered, but still keep those administrative controls very locked down. And this is great for just in general, reducing attack surface on your proxy. So here, one other thing we mentioned earlier is that you can ship logs and other data. Reverse proxies are seeing the traffic flow back and forth, and there's a wealth of data that can be used here. My favorite use case as an Automate infrastructure guy are for troubleshooting application issues. Why is my server running slow after the last patch? It was easy for me to go in and see that, well, the web traffic, I'm seeing delays in it, but everything else looks rather normal, and keep on troubleshooting. There are also potential applications for SIM tools or anything else you're using security-wise to ship logs or meet compliance requirements. This isn't a feature that's out in production yet, but the Automation Theory proxy service supports log shipping through Telegraph. So if you have something that can receive that data, we can configure this. Last but not least, it's not all sunshine and rainbows in the reverse proxy world. First and foremost, reverse proxies do void the warranty from ConnectWise support. Now, I've, in all honesty, never had an issue when troubleshooting issues with my production Automate server. I've never had support even be able to tell that there's a reverse proxy in play. But with that, there's always the potential of breaking changes being introduced upstream, but that's very rare. Otherwise, there are a couple other known issues there on the slide, and by and large, we can adjust configuration and correct them. The CORS validation for SSO does impact a little bit of the trial workflow of the proxy service, which I'll talk about on the slide with the actual diagrams coming up shortly. But how you implement whatever reverse proxy solution you go with is going to, by and large, impact what adjustments you'll need to make on the Automate server side. So with that, just a quick overview of the proxy service that I have mentioned. Here at Automation Theory, we call it reverse proxy as a service. And it's a managed proxy service designed specifically for Automate. We host the proxy out in space, and then we configure your Automate server to use it. It can provide all of the features and benefits described through the slides, and we can deploy these very quickly. We have the ability to provision them through the API of our hosting provider, and I can get you a proxy in about 5 minutes. And our service, it eliminates the traditional complexities with deploying reverse proxies, and it also just takes the management of that tool stack off of you as the IT provider. Reverse proxies have their own surfaces, which can have vulnerabilities, and it's also something where, if done incorrectly, you can obviously start to introduce some downtime, and there's time and effort that goes into these implementations. So I also always like to call out that this solution works for both TCP and UDP traffic, and that UDP configuration is optional. We also have clients who use their proxy for control, and we have the ability to deploy the proxy in a clustered configuration for throughput, redundancy, and disaster recovery scenarios. So with that, are there any questions? Any other questions? Looking in the chat here, a question about shipping logs, and yes, so that screenshot from the previous slides was indeed of InfluxDB, and we have a question about can Perch consume the logs? I've never contacted Perch and gotten their specifications for log formatting, but basically it boils down to syslog. So that's a widely accepted protocol, and we can ship over syslog. See, we have a question about pricing. And my deployment model slide is actually flipped around here. So as far as pricing goes, we sell the proxy at a flat rate per instance. So it's $150 a month per instance. If you're under 5,000 agents, one instance will do you just fine. But if you have disaster recovery or compliance concerns, or you're wanting to go ahead and beef up your proxy or run additional applications like control behind it, you are absolutely welcome to have multiple instances of the proxy. And, as the name suggests, it's HA. So it is designed to gracefully fail over, move between requests. We can also accommodate, we have some current clients who have multiple WAN connections. And so if you want one pane of glass for your Automate server, no matter what WAN backend you're using, we can also accommodate that through HA proxy in our reverse proxy service. And this is the drop-in deployment model. So right now, if you're not using a proxy, your agent is communicating through the internet, it's hitting your firewall, and then it goes to your Automate server. And when we spin up a proxy, the proxy is hanging out there up in the cloud. And your agents are still going through the internet to your firewall and your Automate server. And what we do, we've basically added a second front end to your Automate server, and we create that red arrow, where we start to route agent traffic through the reverse proxy. You can route technician traffic through that reverse proxy if you plan on using it for technician traffic. And then eventually, if you decide that, yes, the solution works, we've validated all the use cases, there are no technical incompatibilities, and we like it, the final phase of the deployment is to eliminate that blue arrow where the internet can communicate directly to your NAT rule. And we do that with just a little ACL, where in your firewall, you'll say you'll only allow that 443 traffic from the reverse proxy instance. And there are normally questions about, hey, if there's an upstream issue, well, what's the failover plan for the proxy? And well, when you're configuring your agent templates, you'll go ahead and you'll keep your existing servers FQDN. And then, yeah, in case there's an upstream provider issue, because every cloud provider has outages, you'll just take out that ACL. Your agents will start communicating directly with your firewall. And operationally, you're back in business within about 5 minutes. So let's see here. A couple more questions have rolled in. And as far as implementation for hosted instances, there shouldn't be any support issues, but you won't be able to have the elimination of the blue arrow. I'll always be able to hit yourname.hostedramm.com and talk to your Automate instance. And let's see, other question, reverse proxy blocking traffic. And yes, once the reverse proxy is in place, you are able to go ahead and block any traffic not coming from the reverse proxy through your firewall to the Automate server. The one thing I'll call out with that is it's a matter of the agents checking in and getting those updated template settings. So, Bob's laptop that's sitting in a closet that hasn't been powered on for 3 months, that if you ACL your firewall and raise shields before his agent checks in, he's not going to have that setting. But with that, you can quickly toggle your firewall ACL to communicate that through. It's just something you'll need to have planned out and ironed out internally before deploying the proxy. And there's a question about Nginx compared to some alternatives or other proxy software. And there's a community guide for how to deploy your own reverse proxy with Nginx. That's written by Jesse from the MSP Geek Slack. And you can absolutely follow that guide. It's absolutely fine for creating a reverse proxy. You don't have the additional security layers bolted in, and now you're managing a Ubuntu box or whatever distribution of choice you want. And there are some MSPs who can do that, and that's great. And they have that skill set in-house, and that's comfortable for them. But for a lot of us, it's hard I'd argue that if you're going to do that, you need to have more than one person who can support your reverse proxy. Because as we talked about, if your reverse proxy goes down, you lose communication with all your agents. And depending on the particulars, that impacts you differently. With the drop-in solution, you can toggle and be back online within 5 minutes. So, are there any other questions? Well, with that, if there is anything you're curious about, by all means, feel free to send a message to support at automationtheory.org, and that'll hit our ticketing system. We'll be able to get back to you. And there was one last question that snuck in about reverse proxy handle control instances. And yes, you can absolutely route your control instance through the reverse proxy. And by and large, we can actually do that on the same proxy instance. If you, depending on size, of course, if you have 3,000 agents, that should work just fine. If you are at 5,000 agents and then you want to add control to that, which if you go to your Automate server and use PowerShell to measure the TCP connections and then do it on control, control normally has about 3 times as many TCP connections as your Automate server. So I'd encourage a second instance for that scenario, but yes, you can. Let's see. There was a question on the diagram here. And yes, we are eliminating the blue line by only accepting traffic from the reverse proxy, which is the end goal. The only time you can't do that is if you're in the ConnectWise cloud, where you're not able to control the firewall in front of your Automate server. Any other questions? All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. This was our very first webinar. So with that, this recording will go ahead and be published to YouTube shortly. And when we go ahead and close things out here, Zoom should direct you to our first proxy page where we have more information, and you'll be able to either fill out a self-service quote or request a trial instance. So thank you all and have a great weekend.